Hey everyone, welcome back to Midnight Outcry. In this episode, I'll be discussing 10 real, unsettling tales pertaining to the Appalachian Mountains. These stories remind us of the reason you should never drive on some Appalachian roads after dark. However, before starting, please think about subscribing and remember to like and tell your friends about it. Tell me where you are observing from. Many thanks to all of you. Let's get started now. My uncle's temporary position was the first step. First story waiting for me. Off-book seasonal labor assisting with property inspections in the eastern Deeplands, Kentucky. This small contracting business was owned by a buddy of his. Primarily handled upkeep for abandoned hunting cottages strewn throughout the Appalachian Mountains. Before the snow began to adhere, they would send someone out to physically inspect the cottages to ensure that no one had broken in, that the roofs hadn't fallen, and indications of decay or raccoons gnawing on the insulation. Simple items on a checklist. Considering how remote most of these locations were, the pay was greater than you might have imagined. Additionally, the finest aspect is that it didn't necessitate extensive conversation. At the time, I was going through a strange phase. Worn thin, actually open to crowds or discourse. Thus, when they gave me a gas card, the keys, the inspection paperwork, and I accepted the beat-up company pickup without hesitation. The folder was substantial. Perhaps a total of 30 cabins. Every key was attached to a metal tag bearing the cabin stamp. Number, cabin 1, cabin 2, and the name of the closest brook or route. The majority could only be accessed by ancient dirt roads that wound through the slopes as if they were terrified of being located. No signal from the cell. Only dirt, trees, and the occasional roadway sign mailbox protruding like a gravestone from a ditch. The condition of some cabins was unexpectedly nice. Some of them there were no more than 4 slanting walls and a star-seeing ceiling. Since I was accustomed to rural things, none of that truly caught me off guard. By the 4th day, I had already visited 12 cottages with nothing noteworthy to report. A little mold. Here, there are loose hinges. Poop from raccoons in the corner. It's fairly normal fare. Next was number 13. Hawthorne Creek 4 was written on the key tag. No sign was present, indicating the turnoff. Just a wooden pillar that was fractured and tilted sideways. The paint time has nearly bleached it away. I eased the truck off the road by a drooping barbed wire fence by slowing down. The between corroded pillars, wire dangled like damp string, open without a chain or lock. Close enough to seem like a dare, yet open enough to allow the inquisitive. I sliced the engine, put the keys in the pocket, and went outside. It was dry and abrasive. Everybody, trees huddled close to me, their exposed branches rattling like tin can bones. I ascended the gate. There was a faint, walkable route that had been worn more by time than by people. It went uphill, in a slack curve. Maybe 10 minutes were needed to get to the top. The cabin was situated there was a shallow clearing that seemed to be attempting to tilt back into the slope. Worn siding that is dark, one boarded-up window. The shingles of the metal chimney corrode like dried blood. Looked neglected, not frightening. Forgotten, I knocked. I have no idea why. I suppose it's reflex. After that, I opened the door and stepped inside. Within, it was a tiny space, just one room. Dust so dense that the edges of everything. A stove, a cot, and many shelves that were crookedly bolted to the wall. It appeared undisturbed. Didn't even perceive any vandalism. Just in time, sealed. Aside from the air, the atmosphere was away. Not moldy or musty, not rotten. The air seemed to be stagnant, as if it didn't be able to move. It was chilly in the corners and heavier close to the floor. I attempted to ignore it, concentrated on the task, crossed it off the checklist, and roofed unharmed, windows locked, and indications of animal intrusion. Not at all. Next, I saw a narrow door partially open at the rear corner. I took a step in its direction, unintentionally moving one hand toward the clipped to my belt as a multi-tool. There was no closet inside. Otherwise, it wasn't in any common sense. Glass jars filled the room from floor to ceiling, carefully stacked, sorted by size, then by label. Numerous ones. Some are as tiny as baby food containers, while others are larger than pickle jars, yet they are all filled with a yellowish, hazy liquid. Lung, thigh, vertebra, ear, and each one is neatly labeled in faded, meticulous handwriting. Scalp. I recall seeing a nail bed with a label. Eye tooth, said another. There were little pieces of bone inside the jars. Others had hair still sticking to the skin, and skin fragments curled like wet leaves. Sides. They weren't thrown in like trash. They were well prepared, carefully, categorized by area. The lower limbs, the upper limbs, facial and internal. It was similar to entering a carefully planned museum show. Who had no business being close to people at all. It was old, I told myself. Some sort of illicit taxidermy in the wilderness. A pastime of a sick amateur biologist, perhaps. It wasn't new, but it was legal. That was what I repeatedly told myself. Still, I snapped a picture. I just snapped it quickly, like if I was terrified of the phone. Might capture more than I desired. Then, mostly to keep my hands occupied, I marked the form and shut the door. Else, and went back out. However, the trail appeared more subdued, less wide. With branches lower than previously, the trees had infiltrated, as if they'd grew lower while my 10 minutes inside. I tried to ignore the tension tugging at my back as I walked. The hills slanted in a different direction, and the trail bent incorrectly. I walked more quickly, then more quickly. By then, I ought to have noticed the gate, the truck, and the rusted barbed wire, but the air was pulled closer, and there were just more trees and undergrowth. Sound felt as though I were walking underwater, muted. Not a single bird or crunch of light. There was only a flat silence with leaves beneath. In the hopes of going back, I turned around, back to the cabin, and begin anew. Try again from a different perspective. The clearance showed up, but I was instantly halted. The door of the cabin was open. I knew I would shut it, had heard the latch click. The jars were no longer in the closet within. They were out, placed neatly, grouped by the stove, on the windowsill, and one seated directly in the center of the cot. Additionally, there were now more of them, dozens more. Perhaps twice as many as previously. The labels remained intact. No longer. They were new, written on the wrist, femur, and thick dark strobes. Palate, and a jar marked dung rested in the middle, resembling the centerpiece of some hideous dinner table. It was the sole one that isn't sealed. A portion of the liquid had seeped into the carton underneath it after spilling down the side. One canasva left a whitish ring that is nearly greasy. The stench wasn't horrible or harsh. It was just off, like something that is too old to be named. Nothing was touched by me, didn't say anything, didn't even take a few breaths. I took my radio off my hip, backed out the door, and pressed the call button. Not moving. No sound. Not a crackling. Only a long, continuous buzz, similar to the sound of a screen left on in a room with no people. I walked around. Not wab yet. Not quite yet. Wanted to avoid feeling like a prey. However, I moved quickly, pushed through the branches, once tripped, struck my knee on a grave path, continued, till I caught sight of it. The gleam of metal. My vehicle exactly where I left it. I nearly lost faith in my sight. Additionally, it appeared excessively clean. Still, however, I ran. As if my legs weren't mine, they covered the final stretch. The door of the driver was locked. That caught me off guard. During inspection runs, I kept the keys in my pocket, but never locked the door. I wrenched it open, unlocked it, and flung myself inside. I then noticed the jar, perfectly positioned in the center of the dashboard, square in shape, as if it had just been put there moments ago, with no moisture. The label was distinct, with the same handwriting voice. I gazed at it for an entire heartbeat, not breathing, but moving. I turned the key after that. The engine started. I banged Without looking, he put the truck in reverse and backed out. Under the tires, the gravel crunched as if it were attempting to keep me there. I continued to drive. For turns, no. Not because it was rattling in the rear seat. Not even when I believed I noticed a change in the rearview mirror. I spent more than an hour driving before. In the opposite lane, another vehicle went by. My signal returned. I called my uncle first thing in the morning, informed him I was ill, was not going to complete the task, omitted specifics, didn't bring up the picture, failed to return the clipboard or the keys. I took a direct drive home, didn't just pause once. Music's second story. I met Vince at a hardware store in Barlow, and he helped me get the job. They needed assistance clearing, he said. Trails on private property, seasonal work, and financial support. He wrote down a number. Stated, if I'm not the twitchy type, I'd like the isolation, and instructed me to ask for Maynard on a napkin. No, I wasn't. I didn't think so anyway. It was late September and fall. Approaching October, and after leaving a warehouse job, I had been living out of my car for a few months. This gave me a sense of relief and spaciousness. It's time to reflect. There wasn't much promotion for the Conservancy. No webpage, no brochure, merely a scrawled address on the reverse of a folded paper map that appeared to be older than I was. When I received, it hardly seems genuine there. There was a rusty gate at the entry, strung with a loose hidden off Route 27 at the end of a meandering dirt lane. A sign made of plywood. Hanging at an angle, the Black Hollow Nature Reserve was hand-painted with chipping white letters, and only approved entry was allowed. Just inside the gate was the trailhead cabin, which was tiny, perhaps 12 by 12, and had a distorted roof, as well as a porch that drooped as if it hadn't been used for years. There was Maynard. Reflective vest, gray hair, hands that resemble cracked leather. Asked if I had a machete without saying anything else. I gave a nod. He gave me a faded topographical map and what appeared to be a two-way radio. From a pawn store, and indicated my starting place. Section 3. He created a point to draw a red X across the Pine Gulch location. He said, "Stay out of there," as if it were the only rule worth following. Repeating. Unstable terrain. When you turn around, no one is trying to take advantage of you. I gave another nod. He didn't grin, simply turned around and returned inside. My vehicle was parked next to the A. I slung my rucksack over my shoulder and entered the cabin. Food, drink, tarp, and spare knife and batteries. Everything felt good. I like being by myself in the forest. Always had. In its own way, it was peaceful and predictable. Although the path was short, passable, covered in old pine needles and fallen limbs. There was a wooden post every few hundred yards the maintenance path is marked with a carved number and a splatter of red paint. They prevented us from deviating in this way. Away, easy, follow the paint and keep the numbers rising. I may have hiked for 3 hours prior to arriving at the campsite. It was merely an area of cleared ground with a broken fire and trees all around. Ring and an ancient bench that is decaying in the earth. No shelter, no platform, simply leaf litter and the open sky. I pulled the tarp between 2 trees, dumped my pack, and began to collect wood. The fragrance of October was in the air, crumbling and dry. No, however, there are no insects or birds, only wind, leaves, and the far-off brook of trees swaying in opposition to one another. I boiled whatever I could in a cup for dinner. In my glove box, I had half a piece of cornbread that had solidified, instant noodles, and a granola bar. I sat and nibbled slowly. The fire flickered between me and the trail as I walked cross-legged. I'd organized my supplies by keeping a knife handy, headlamp fastened to the bag, boots close to the tarp, everything that I could quickly grab if someone sniffed, just in case. Then something happened. It began modestly. A gentle thump, not much louder than a pine cone falling behind me, 10 or 12 feet back, perhaps. The final bite of cornbread was halfway to my mouth when I froze. remained motionless, didn't take a breath, slowly turned. Nothing, simply brush and shadows. I stood, crushing leaves beneath my boots as I made a careful circuit around the camp. Nothing changed, no breathless eyes. I dismissed it and took a seat again. That is when I became aware of it. Squarely in the middle of my dining cloth, this small stone is smooth and spherical. Tidy. I would have spotted it earlier, but I hadn't. Dead center, exactly where my spoon had been. I grabbed it. The temperature was warm. Hand not warm in the sun warm, like a warm touch. Not from resting on the ground, but from a certain kind of warmth. Eye behind me, scanning the slope. No broken branches, no tracks, except something seemed to be waiting to see what I would do, and the feeling had changed. I repositioned my seat so that my back was against a tree rather than an open area, and put additional wood on the fire. I kept my headlamp on, strapped a knife to my belt, and convinced myself it was nothing. Perhaps it had come rolling down from above. Perhaps I had kicked it without realizing it previously. It's simple to tell rational lies in the dark. It wasn't sleep. With one eye open and my heart pounding, I lay beneath the tarp, a bit quicker than I preferred. Every sound seemed intimate. Each wind gust produced. Brace yourself. I fell asleep somewhere after midnight. Then I heard it once more. Louder. Not even a thump. A succession of methodical, sluggish rustles. 1, 2, D3. Give up. Once more, but from a different perspective. There was no breeze. It wasn't a creature. It was excessively sluggish. Too deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight. It was absent. I was startled upright. I had left my equipment precisely where I had left it. The lamp was fastened to the top of my pack. On my right hip is a knife. My feet are boots. The lamp was now absent. Additionally, one boot was pulled several feet to the side. Taking out my backup flashlight, I switched it on and swept a leisurely arc over the beam. Something near the edge of the clearing caught the light. I'm sitting with my headlight still on, standing erect in the leaves, gleaming dimly beneath the trees as if it had been carefully positioned there, but far enough away to come get it for me. With my knees rigid and my breathing shallow, I stepped out to it, picked it up, rising, still bright, still heated. Other than that, no movement, no sound. I made a complete circle, just me. No snapped twigs, no footprints, clutching my own stolen lamp while standing in a circle of quiet. From then on, I brought everything near the flames, laid it down, in the sunshine, all out. I waited while holding the knife in one hand and a flashlight in the other. It took very little time. Perhaps 30 minutes later, just beyond the glow of the fire, the footsteps began. Dully measured. Dull. An animal cannot carry it. Too composed for someone who didn't desire to be noticed. At first, they made a wide circle around the camp, perhaps 20 feet out. Next, always just out of sight, yet closer. I didn't yell. A branch that I tossed into the forest. Like whoever it was, the steps paused and then resumed their usual pace. Had anticipated the response and accepted it. I never slept again. Until the flames turned to white ash, I said I must have fainted while sitting up at one point. I opened my eyes to see everything was quiet and the sun had risen. No noises, no birds, no insects. That weightless, dead silence. In less than 5 minutes, I packed everything, began to walk without eating or consulting the map. The trail didn't feel right. The first marking was absent. Second was present, but facing the opposite direction. Someone had turned the arrow in the wrong direction and sprayed over the original red number. I looked at my phone. No signal. GPS remained. I stammered as if I were in a dead zone. I finally located the correct fork, but it took hours longer than necessary. Possess. I almost started crying when I eventually spotted the ranger shack once more. Didn't. Put an end to it. Didn't turn around. I just drove after shakily unlocking my automobile. Didn't even swap out clothing. I simply drove into the first diner I came across after seeing a sign advertising Bell Point. I parked, took a seat in the booth, placed my coffee order, and bided my time till the shaking subsided. It took me some time to get to the restroom. As I did, I noticed it on my car's rear windshield, pulled into the mountain dust layer. This symbol is a flawless ring with a downward vertical line. The middle. I knew what it was. It's the same one from the map's red X. Identical symbol from the Pine Gulch. My knuckles turned red as I washed the glass after driving directly to a vehicle wash. Throughout the entire time, I couldn't get rid of the impression that someone was waiting and watching in the trees just beyond the road. That evening, I didn't get much sleep. I heard the same steady footsteps each time I closed my eyes. Same tempo, same rhythm. The following morning, I looked through forums, local Reddit posts, hiking boards, and camping locations. Not a word about the emblem. Nothing regarding flip signs or path markers being absent. Only general cautions to stay on the main loop. Then I received a direct message. Through a disposable account. Claimed to have worked there before. Claimed to have barely survived 4 days. That was it. No name, no follow-up. The following morning, the account was deleted. I tried contacting the Conservancy by email. Received no response. The phone went dead for Maynard. It was 2 weeks later. Then one morning I discovered a plain white envelope in my mailbox. No stamp. No address for return. A picture, printed on glossy paper, was within. I was the one. Holding that smooth, tiny stone while leaning forward at the fire. Picture was captured perhaps 20 feet back in the woods. Angle was ideal. Framed. No haze, no movement. Only the blackness behind me and me. Thick, but not black. I never mentioned that trip to anyone. Narrative 3. Before the sun came up, I began my shift at the forest station. That strange period of time when it seems like the world is still making decisions whether to remain asleep or get up. I arrived in the parking lot carrying my typical bag of groceries and a lukewarm thermos of coffee. The passenger seat's gear is rattling. There were fewer hikers in early November, fewer calls, as well as much more silence. It's a stillness, but not a peaceful silence. There was one strange entry in the daily log that morning. Only a single radio message. The voice of a lady, quiet but determined. Off the path. The line is invisible to me. Please respond. That was it. At 4:03 a.m. the footage had logged, and did it once more, cutting out entirely. We occasionally receive prank transmissions and phony call broadcasts that bounce off towers, but this one was too incisive to ignore. It plummeted directly into a section of forest that we hardly ever used, and it had coordinates attached. No longer. With the exception of the occasional training run, we largely ignored this section, or test for burns. No regular patrols, no public trails. Usually I would send. I had to wait at Central Dispatch, but the place was only a few miles from my normal grid, and to be honest, the silence was itching a little. I reasoned that I could investigate and return before noon. I threw the coordinates into a printer. I loaded up my backpack with extra supplies and drove the truck down a service road until the trees grew too dense and I had to pull over. At a gate that has corroded. The road narrowed past the gate to something that was barely a trail. Barely walking, but yet. I had to sidestep and duck beneath branches. Mud spots, and to stay on course, check my compass every few minutes. Low, dense, and motionless fog, settling in the valleys that separate the hills. Everything was muffled. The birds had stopped talking as well. I continued to play the transmission back via my headgear. I couldn't get that woman's voice out of my brain. She didn't seem alarmed, but purposeful, as if she had already uttered the words 100 times. That was the quiet you hear just before someone gives up. After a few hours, I had to slow down since the land began to slope more steeply. At that point, I discovered the first hint. A single, tiny, fresh boot print was embedded in the moss close to a crooked tree. Stump. It was probably a woman's, thin. Adjacent to it was a torn fragment of brilliant yellow webbing with ragged edges, definitely a backpack strap. I attempted to radio it in after bagging it and marking a location. Nothing. The phrase flatlined after a single crackling. I changed the frequency. Nothing has changed. I took out my phone. No assistance. That was illogical. I remained inside. The area of coverage. At the trailhead, I had received texts. As a precaution, I even waved the phone around like a dope, however, deceased. When I turned to go back, the path I had entered was gone, as if entirely. Somehow, the leaves had moved. Or, perhaps, I had not been on a true trail after all. I got up. There for a considerable amount of time, scanning all directions and attempting to recall which landmarks I had passed. But it all now had the same appearance. More woods, fog, rocks, and more rocks. I fell to a knee, set out my mat and compass to orient myself, and saw that the compass needle was twitching as if it were anxious. It continued to begin making full, slow rotations after swinging from north to east. I gave a tap. Ick it. Nothing. Adjusted, but still spinning. Initially, I laughed. Only a brief, uncomfortable, okay, then laugh. However, after observing that needle's brief dance for a few more minutes, my gut began to clench. I chose a westward direction and attached a piece of orange survey tape on the closest branch, in the spot where I thought I had come in. I continued to go, making notes every few minutes. After almost an hour, I took a step, entered a clearing, and noticed the same ripped, mossy stump and boot print. The yellow strap is partially hidden in the ground. Perhaps I had circled by accident, I thought. I then looked at the markings I had made. Nothing. No footsteps, no tape, no follow me. The surrounding forest didn't appear to care if I might have walked a straight path. No longer in straight lines. Even the light had changed. It wasn't exactly growing darker. It simply appeared more drab, similar to Even though there were no clouds, the sun was hidden by something dense. My timepiece claimed it was just afternoon, yet it appeared to be late nightfall wherever I looked. I stopped attempting to navigate, returned and began preparing a rest area. My tarp was strung between two trees, set rationed water and turned off the emergency radio beacon. I turned on the beacon and let it to beat. A gentle ding, then her voice once more, similar to the video, however now more obvious. "Stop walking," she advised. That's what I attempted. All it does is loop. She seemed composed, as if she were offering wise counsel based on her own experience. Despite knowing her name, I still inquired. Useless. I heard a syllable before the response was cut off in the middle, jumbled by static. Marin, perhaps. Marin, perhaps, but no more. I didn't get any sleep that night. At least 3 times, the beacon turned itself back on. I turned it off every time. And every time it restarted by itself. Every time my GPS recorded a fresh log stating that, although not moving from under the tarp, I had occasionally traveled miles. Just in case, I wrapped it in foil. The transmission was being disrupted by something. Didn't matter. 12 fresh logs had emerged by sunrise. I continued to go more slowly. Right now. The direction didn't seem reliable to me. Didn't believe my equipment. Didn't have faith in the landscape. I stumbled onto a clearing I had never seen before somewhere in the late morning. I initially believed it to be one of our former training grounds. We occasionally conducted drills this far, but nothing. It appeared to be recent. Half of a green 2-man tent fell down. A silver emergency. Between 2 trees, the blanket is still tightly hung. Clothes were folded too nicely inside the tent. a wrapped rosary twice around a pair of socks that had been folded up, 2 lighters that are empty, a notebook in black. I opened it. Marin's name appeared in pale blue ink on the first page. The entries were dated July, but not the year. However, based on the paper's state and style, it had been there for a time. I cautiously moved out of the tent after reading the final message, which said, "Please tell him I stayed where I was told." Something pertaining to the location felt unaltered, yet not deserted, preserved or observed. Next, I saw 2 circles of flames. One had the borders of ancient soot-crusted black. The other, when I hovered my palm over it, appeared fresh, damp ash, gray rather than black and still warm. Absence of footprints all surrounding it. It sat there as if someone had doused it with no drag marks and stepped back into nothingness. I tugged. I marked the place with my GPS. There was a glitch. The screen flickered and blinked, then reset after a lengthy pause. When it returned, the interface's date read 2 years from now, on October 14th. I restarted it by hand. The date has been updated. It flashed once more before permanently shutting off. The silver blanket was gone when I glanced up again. The tent remained intact, but the dirt beneath it appeared different. Fresh, level, as if it had just been laid. Indentation where I had been kneeling minutes before. I turned to go. Saw motion, just a form, a flash to my right. Just standing, not moving, not swaying, completely still. I gave it a direct glance. Nothing, just a small path where no one had existed. I accepted it. After the trees became more distant and the canopy dropped, I eventually caught sight of the valley, and there it was, a telltale flare of sunlight caught on the ranger station's roof. I was so relieved that I almost choked. The radio then made a clicking sound. Her voice was clear and closed once more. "I'll be there when you give up walking." I paused, caught my breath, and turned 10 feet back to see another tent with the same model, identical color. The identical silver blanket was knotted in the same manner. Opened the flap. My own pack, inside my equipment. Right now my water bottle is half full. My notepad turned to an empty page. My radio is still working. I ran after grabbing everything. Didn't consider or turn around. I sliced my leg on a rock I never saw, ripped through trees, and slid down muddy slopes. Approaching. However, I continued until my boots struck gravel. There was a road. It was my vehicle. After climbing in and slamming the door, I remained motionless for 5 complete minutes. Once, the dash radio hissed. Only a tiny pop of static before being silent. The clock was off back at the outpost. 1 hour in advance, my boss appeared shocked when I entered. Claimed I had been absent for almost 24 hours. My vehicle. There was no movement in the log. I never had a tower pinged by my phone. They wanted to know where I'd gone. I simply replied, "I'm not sure." Search and rescue operations began the following morning. Out with my coordinates. They couldn't find anything. No blanket, no tent, nothing but 2 pairs of my boot prints and campfire rings. One group led one east, the other west. The report was written by me, signed, and then filed. I looked at the station's radio log before leaving. The initial message remained, continuing to loop. The timestamp now reads October 14th of the next year. I erased it, and I powered. I parked after locking the station and driving till I reached the viewpoint, atop the ridge, and never returned. Music, Narrative 4. At 6 o'clock, I began my shift at the ranger station. The mountains were already dark at that time. Darkness like that strikes October as a quick month. No forewarning, no sunset display. Simply disappeared. The Appalachians received strangely silent during that season. Heavy, but not calm, as the hills are containing something. Indeed, tourists were still present, searching for the final hues, pausing at vantage points and inquiring. The same 5 inquiries concerning the foliage. However, the park quickly fills up after sunset. There are no autos in the lots. Only the trees, the air, and whatever doesn't mind being by itself may be heard on the trails. There are no sounds. I wasn't there that night, even planned to be absent. Ben reported a last-minute case of food illness, or even burnout. Since I lived nearby, I informed I would cover dispatch. They gave Miller's Ridge to me. We typically close this loop following Labor Day. Too faded out, no mobile reception anywhere, and some areas are too steep. However, the gate key remained attached on its hook. Thus, I took a radio that could as well have been a paperweight, a torch, and a first aid bag that was hardly filled. 3 nights had passed since the last entry in the log. Routine examination. Nothing. I parked and got out at the trailhead. It's already cold. Not really dramatic. Just that cunning cold that creeps in before you know it. Your sleeves. After noting my start time and locking up the truck, I entered the trail. It's a narrow, occasionally uneven, and often forgotten after the summer. In certain places, the walkway is crossed with knotted roots that resemble ribs. Additional areas where your legs are bitten by the slope, a gentle reminder that you are not getting any younger. I caught it after 15 minutes. A little orange radiance off to on the left. What was remained of a campfire, anyway. It was tiny and dwindling, yet it was clearly not chilly yet, indicating that someone had recently visited this location. Permits were not granted for this location, not within a few weeks. I pursued the smoke. That tiny, sour trace was all that was present. Of charred wood sticking to the moisture. The clearing was small, most likely not even organic. It appeared more as though the brush had been manually removed. A fire ring was created. Little D said, of river stones, still a little steaming. An old, discolored rucksack resting on a stump. The zippers were somewhat corroded. A sleeping bag curled like a dead bug beside it. Stiff, oily looking, similar to since the Clinton era, it had not seen a washing machine. Additionally, protruding directly from the kitchen knife and mud. Not a bushcraft tool or blade, but a typical knife with 2 edges. The kind you cut carrots with. This was the only one who looked, as though it had been severing another object. I squatted down and illuminated the clearing. Cleaner, the knife glinted, more than it ought to have been. I said it at that point. "Hello, Park Service. You can't camp here, but you're not in any trouble." All night. Silence at first. Then, from beyond the woods, lofty, gentle, a man stepped into my flashlight's beam. Not menacing, just there. Perhaps in the mid-30s. It was difficult to pinpoint. With that sunken face, he looked emaciated. A cheek expression that results from spending too much time outside. Pale, strained skin like paper over his jaw. Palms out, he lifted his hands slightly. "I didn't to frighten you," he stated. He shook his head, saying, "I asked if he was passing through." His words were, "Just resting. I needed to stop somewhere quiet after strolling for a while, so I asked for his permit." He grinned. "Hardly there. I didn't anticipate needing one anymore. The majority of this isn't actually parkland anymore. Something in my head was triggered by that." "Really? What do you mean by not?" He surveyed the area as if he had been examining the trees themselves. He questioned, "You don't hear them?" He nodded when I informed him, "No." "So you're still new?" After a single, brief blast of static, my radio died. I tried to phone it in by pressing the button once more. Nothing. He observed me, calmly, as if he had anticipated that. He couldn't stay, I informed him, and we'd walk back together and make plans for the next day. He nodded slowly before adding, "You should." I hesitated and said, "Tell the others to stop following me." He gestured to the ridge trail behind me and asked, "What others?" "The ones—" "That's a lie," he said. He moved in closer, saying, "They follow people like you, the ones who walk alone." I took note. There was no sound from his feet. There are twigs and leaves everywhere, but not one crunch. He grinned once more. Not evil. Not amiable either. You can't always... He said, "Tell who's real. You must make sure. You must peek beneath." The knife caught their attention. I followed his eyes. He chuckled softly. Not for you, you remain whole. However, after the sun goes down, some of them shift. The skin no longer fits properly. Something chilly ran down my spine. I offered to make a phone call. He gave a head shake, unable to leave, returning to the city. They're waiting for me. Who? I asked. He glanced at the black line of woods beyond me. They constructed the town incorrectly. I forgot what was sleeping beneath it. It wasn't wild the way he stated it. It wasn't a tirade. The simple truth. I stepped back. His gaze trailed behind. Do you believe I'm insane? He stated. I didn't respond. He knelt down and brushed the dirt close to the knife as if it were something recognizable. They call you crazy before you start to change, he added. Next, in a soft, even compassionate tone, you should. I inquired if he would stay there, and he said, go before they notice you. For now, he stated. I like when I'm discovered by someone fresh. It reminds me of the appearance of genuine faces. I turned, began to walk without hearing him follow. Not necessary. I sensed his gaze on until I lost sight of the trail as it bent. Then, I sprinted. Branches cut my arms with a knife. The cold made my breath catch in my throat. My hands were shaking too much by the time I got to the truck to work the keys. Twice I dropped them. In at last, locked everything, turned on the engine, and gave the radio another go. Not moving. Then, for a little while, a voice. The same one. Hello. Then there was quiet. I left the park in my car, as if something was pursuing me. Trees that appeared to be too close to one another were illuminated by headlights, as if they had changed while I was away. My phone came on when I got to the main road. Missed calls and dispatch pings. I claimed I was all right. Claimed that it was interference. Did not bring up the man. The knife was not mentioned. Didn't bring up what he mentioned regarding skin peeling. Still, I told my boss the following morning. She dispatched a group to Miller's Ridge. The clearing was still warm when they arrived, but there was no sleeping bag or knife. Only one pair of footprints moving in the direction of the ridge. The issue. The ridge has a landslide outcome. Sheer drop of 40 feet. No warning, no guardrail, just rock and roots. At the very edge, the railroad came to a stop. No indication of a fall. Not a single drag mark. Simply stopped. It was noted as a brief glimpse. Nothing more. However, there has been a fire ring in that same area every year since I completed that loop. Always warm, always fresh, never on fire. One year, an open, empty can of beans was placed next to the stones, as if it had just been rinsed. I discovered tracks around the ring another year, both mine and someone else's, standing side by side after twice. I heard footsteps behind me last October. Nothing when I turned around. After that, a lantern light flickered just beyond the trees. Slow, slow, slow. I froze, and it froze, blinking out. 2 evenings I saw him again after patrol, while I was driving back into town. Same face, same walking at a leisurely pace, as if nothing had changed. He held up a hand, but simply recognizing me and waving. I didn't pause or second-guess myself. However, in the back view, there was another thing. Matching speed, not running. Behind the truck, simply staying up to date. It never broke or fell back, even as the path twisted and the woods got dense once more. Stride. Simply moved steadily as if it was familiar with every turn. As I arrived at the I parked behind the street lamp and waited there until the sun came up. Diner. Narrative 5 Mara is my name. That evening, when I eventually shut down the diner, the clock over the register had it was past midnight. It had been one of those long October evenings when everything seems to be moving slowly, and a bit more slowly than it ought to. October always seems to drag up here in the highlands. Even for visitors who believe they are prepared for it, it is colder than anyone anticipates. They are drawn to the hues, the mist. The photo opportunities include dilapidated mining communities that appear eerily eerie even during the day. They are unaware of how profound when the last lights go out, the hills disappear. I turned the key in the door, cleaned the counters one more time, and entered the parking lot behind the diner. There was a piercing coldness in the air that clings to clothing. Tyler's vehicle, the lone street lamp, the kind that hums more loudly than it shines, was idling. Leah was sitting on the tailgate, opening and closing her lighter in a tense pattern. When they noticed me, they both glanced up. Tyler said, "Let's go somewhere," with that foolish smile that he always had before committing a risky act. Better than this. Halfway up the slope, he informed us of an old hospital. Fienbenock claimed that his uncle hunted up there in the past. Fienmish was a child. Evidently, decades before, a mudslide had closed the establishment, burying half of it. Although he was unsure if anyone had died, the way he stated it added attention. He assured me that there was a beer cooler at the rear and, upon reaching the summit, a breathtaking panorama of the entire valley. I ought to have returned home. Even so, I was aware of that. Yet, it was late. The diner had a grease and chlorine, and the thought of spending another peaceful evening in my apartment was intolerable. I simply shrugged and got into the truck. I didn't realize the drive would take that long. The road became more winding. The guardrails disappeared as we ascended higher, into spaces that had been broken. Crawling out of the trees, fog encircled the headlights, borders sluggish and dense like smoke that was unable to escape. Not a single other vehicle passed us. Tyler's GPS stopped working at one point, but he simply continued to drive as if he had been there before. According to him, the location was formerly known as Briar Hollow Sanatorium. The name didn't have any significance for me, but Leah claimed that her grandmother had once brought up lightning strikes and patients who wouldn't go. We laughed, but it was not as loud as we intended, and nobody spoke. Then, we parked in front of a rusting iron gate that was nearly engulfed by vines when the route eventually came to an end. Despite the orange streaks on the metal, I could clearly see the word county inscribed on the crossbar. We hid beneath it and proceeded along a small path with crumbling stone walls. Water dripped slowly and hollowly somewhere ahead, like an old underground pipe is still in use. The moon was sufficiently light to show the main building's outline when we noticed it at last. It was at least 3 floors high, if not higher. The roof collapsed in the middle. Its porch sagged, and its windows were hollow and black, as if it had grown weary of standing. Tyler ascended the stairs first. The front door hung on a single hinge, and as he pulled it open, it made a dry, scratching sound. Our phone light swept across inside. Broken furniture, peeling wallpaper, and dust so dense it muffles everything. It felt as though the air itself had been stagnant for decades. A slight draft. The air had been motionless, but it brushed past my face. According to Leah, she heard a trickle. It was gone when we paused to listen. We parted ways to look all around. Tyler turned left, possibly into the kitchen. I took the right wing with Leah, where rows of a small corridor was lined with patient rooms. All the doors were open, with the exception of the last one. That one was chained and closed, tight on the exterior, as if something had to remain inside. It was surrounded by darker walls. The paint popped, like it had never been fixed after it had burnt once. Pulling on the chain, Leah did. She did, of course. I also instructed her to halt. When her fingers touched the metal, she froze, rolling her eyes. She stated it. Felt as frigid as ice. I didn't do my own research. We simply retreated. Tyler got to know us once again in the main hall. "I found stairs going up," he remarked. Despite its decaying appearance, the wood managed to retain our weight. Every footfall squeaked as if to alert us. The second floor has a lengthy. The passageway, which was lined with rusted trays and outdated gurneys, extended in both directions. Cabinets were filled with our lights. When we moved, the dust glistened like frost, and the glass was broken. A subtle sweet fragrance, similar to rotting food, was present. Metal combined with fruit. We discovered a door marked HYD row halfway down the hallway. One metal tub was attached to the floor inside. Above it, chains hung from hooks, and the walls were bordered by pipes that ended in nothing. Still, one of them leaked into the bathtub. the water. Even when we turned them away, they continued to flicker slightly, reflecting our lights. Tyler leaned forward and jerked abruptly back. He said that his own face didn't blink when he did, and that the reflection wasn't correct. I told him he was being a jerk. Joined us, but I felt sick to my stomach. We didn't spend much time there. Another stairwell led down at the far end of the hall. It must descend to the basement, Tyler suggested, possibly to an old treatment ward. His voice had become strained, but he still sounded eager. The deeper we descended, the colder the air got, and it was so wet that our shoes stuck to the stairs. We discovered a tunnel at the base, sealed doors and pipelines. Somewhere far ahead came the sound of trickling water. We entered alone, detecting what appeared to be handprints smudged into the walls with our lights. Some were too high to reach. One door had its hinges bent and was partially open. We pushed it, broader, and discovered a circular room outside. The concrete floor was smooth, with the exception of black spots in the middle. One metal chair with unfastened leather straps was bolted to the floor. Over it, a corroded chain hung. Someone has inscribed a date in white on the distant wall. Chalk, October 12th, and a series of unreadable initials. The chalk seemed as if it had just been drawn, bright and new. "We should go," Leah muttered. Her voice reverberated, yet we heard it once more. From the corner behind the chair, the same voice and phrases could be heard. Nobody was there, Tyler swore, beneath his breath. The door we had entered was gone as we turned to go. There was another sealed one in its place, labeled electric. I attempted to recall if we had previously passed it, but my thoughts felt sluggish, as if everything were collapsing. Tyler began to move more quickly. His hand was trembling slightly. Leah took hold of my arm. According to her, the air tasted like metal. She was correct. The back of my throat ached with every breath. We went with the tunnel till it abruptly bent. Overhead, one light bulb flickered. The house had been without electricity for decades, but it pulsed gently, alive. A set of footsteps was visible in the light approaching us. Uneven, small, and barren. They paused directly beneath the light bulb, then veered to the side and vanished into the wall. Leah let out a sound that sounded more like a stifled moan than a scream. I drew her near and instructed Tyler to locate a way out. We ran because, according to him, he saw stairs ahead. The steps appeared to be dry and firm. We didn't pause to reflect. We emerged at the summit into what appeared to be a very distinct structure. The stone walls were clean and smooth. There was no damage to the ceiling. Through the windows, dim starlight glistened. I briefly believed that we might have gone around in circles. Or perhaps everything down below had been a dark trick. Then I caught a whiff. Antiseptic. That acrid chemical smell hospitals use to conceal the horrible things underneath. From behind one of the doors came a quiet hum. Tyler gave it a shove. Inside, machinery that shouldn't have been there gave off a faint blue glow. Long cables that were looped into the walls. Another chair, identical to the one below, stood in the middle, although this one wasn't empty. There was something sitting in it, hunched over. I initially believed it to be a mannequin. Then it began to breathe. Its skin appeared stretched and gray, but it wasn't dead. It was just wrong. As it raised its head, I noticed that its eyes were the same luminous blue as the machine light. And then Leah cried, "Don't follow the wrong stairs." The sound didn't come from its mouth. Tyler seized my arm and pulled me back. We sprinted through corridors that reorganized, twisted, and turned. Doors disappeared, where they had been just moments before. The building seemed to fold itself to trap us inside. Eventually, I caught a reflected image in a broken mirror. While we were fleeing and the lights were flickering, the lights were still blue, and they were moving gradually and peacefully. When we arrived at it, opened the front door by itself. My face was assaulted by cold air. We ran till the vehicle appeared. On the descent, nobody spoke. There was more quiet, more than anything else. Upon returning to the diner, we simply sat in the parking lot and gazed at the mountains. Leah was trembling. She insisted that while she hadn't smiled, her reflection had. Tyler's grip on the steering wheel was locked. I waited for it to move while I observed the ridgeline. The following, I woke up in the morning with a faint, letter-shaped white smear of chalk on my wrist. Although it washed off, the skin remained white. I saw the same date when I stepped outside to smoke at work. Chalk was used to write October 12th on the dumpster. Perfect, new lines, handwriting. Nobody else took notice. I noticed the earth beneath my shoes when I looked down. Despite the fact that it hadn't rained for days, it was damp. And for a brief moment, I could see the trees behind me through the diner's window. As if they were listening, they leaned in the direction of the building. I didn't wait for Leah or Tyler that evening. I drove without swerving, home, covered the mirrors, and locked all the doors. Music. Narrative 6. On paper, my work was straightforward back then. Keep an eye out, remain alert, and ensure that nobody either stole copper from a defunct hydropower facility or got themselves killed. I worked security for a decommissioning station located approximately 1 hour's drive from the Appalachian foothills. Closest town with operational cell towers. It paid, but it wasn't glamorous. Stable, and nobody disturbed me outside. After a few years, the county hired a small security company to watch over the area. Local scrappers began tearing down fences and removing anything they could carry. Hefty, outdated transformers, cables, corroded tools, and other items that didn't seem valuable until you discovered how much copper they contained. 12 was my shift, between 6 o'clock at night and 6 o'clock in the morning. The hours that cause you to lose track of time if you're not. Be cautious. The sun fell down and stayed low out there. The power plant squatted low in a little depression, encircled by brush and wood. The dam was nothing more than, rather than a patch of crumbling concrete that would never be cleaned, slick with moss and coated in graffiti. It was fed by a river that had dried up to a brown trickle. The road included a chain-link fence, a gravel downhill winding lane, and the small trailer where I ate my sandwiches. Watched a bank of old security screens glimmer in the darkness. The stench of dampness and old coffee filled the trailer. The screens quietly buzzed, displaying erratic black and white feeds of the gate, the yard, and the former control building. Some other decade had frozen their timestamps. I grew accustomed to seeing them. Glitch. For minutes at a time, the image might smear, jump, or go to static. However, in a strange way, it was company. When the woods became too silent, something to gaze at. Every October, there were more intruders and hunters pursuing animals too near the... Before winter shut everything down, there was property, children on dares, and adults looking around for scrap. However, on Thursday, the 13th, which I recall too well, carried a different kind of weight. A sense in the air, not superstition, that something wasn't right. By 9 o'clock, the fog had crept in so densely that it appeared as though the entire globe had shrunk. Of the garden. From the trailer window, my own headlights were just barely visible. Even the river's sound was distorted and no longer present, as if the entire world had been covered by a blanket of fog. I conducted my first patrol at around 10. I walked the fence. After passing the old turbine housing and checking the locks, they went back toward the gate. It was all the same. Padlocks are chilly, chains are tight, and there's that same metallic stench of wet rust. When I arrived, the cameras were still blinking back inside. The yard was empty after 3 feeds. Fourth, the one in front of the gate, made me nauseous. The gate stood ajar. The padlock turned away from the chain, gently rocking. I had just looked it over. I was aware that it was locked. I took out my flashlight and ventured out into the mist. The laser, shining white, spread pointlessly into the mist, creating, it is more difficult to see. The damp gravel crushed my boots. As I arrived at the gate, everything appeared to be in order. It had a tight chain. The lock remained chilly and closed, and firm in my grasp. For a long minute, I merely stared, trying to persuade myself that I could see the picture on the display. Then I saw the single-file footsteps moving toward the drainage ditch and away from the gate. Deep impressions that are too distinct to be ancient. The kind of prints that would appear if someone had just passed by them moments before. I went after them. They may have traveled 20 to 25 feet before coming to a stop just short of the ditch. No continuation, no turning, simply stopped, as if the person who created them had disappeared in the middle of a step. At my hip, my radio crackled. My name is Victor. Nothing otherwise. Before and after there was no static, no background sounds. I didn't recognize the voice. I went cold. It sounded too clear and flat, as if I'd been videotaped expressing my own name, then replayed it via the speaker. "Yeah, who's on?" I said, thumbing the microphone. There was silence. Next, only the buzz of the outdoors. I rewound the tape on the camera feed, back in the trailer. Interference lines that are static and move across the screen. However, just after I'd gone outside, something flickered on the frame's bottom. Gray against the black, a faint form. It walked, approaching the control building from the gate's edge. No flashlight. No, only a guy moving steadily and slowly across the yard in reflection. The following. As it passed the loading dock, the camera briefly captured it. The same stride and height as mine. I grabbed the flashlight once more and crossed the yard. The original control building's form could be seen through the thinning fog. Stood out starkly in the shadows. The double doors had a tight-strung chain. Like it had been, the padlock bowed, struck by a hammer. One door was ajar a little. I yelled, "Security! Come out if you're inside!" Just a tiny echo, nothing. I pushed the door opened, and entered. The beam from my flashlight struck glints of corroded metal and sliced through the dust. It was chilly outside and had a slight burnt plastic odor. I was stopped cold in the middle of the floor. A flawless circle of black stones had been set out by someone. There was a melted clump of copper wire that solidified. It appeared to be recent. As I knelt to examine it more closely, it was still somewhat warm. I thought it smelled like insulation cooking off a wire. The radio hissed at my hip. Victor once more, but more slowly and slowly. Additionally, this time it was what I said. Not merely comparable. My precise inflection, tone, and pitch. I simply waited for it to make sense while gazing at the radio. Then, from a farther location within the structure, I heard deliberate footsteps that even matched the cadence of the ones I had been strolling in. I pointed my illumination in the hallway. A man was standing there. He was dressed in my boots, jacket, and uniform. The identical ID badge fastened on his chest with a clip. He cocked his head to the side until his chin nearly met his shoulder. It appeared as though the muscles weren't holding up properly. He didn't spoke, simply began to approach me. His every move caused the radio to crackle. Louder. Static was no longer the only sound. It breathed like a pulse. Via cables, the air felt heavier as he approached, pressing against like a shift in pressure on my teeth. I retreated a step, then another. He continued to approaching. I let the flashlight fall. His shadow was caught just before the beam cut out as it swirled across the floor. I took off running. The corridor dragged on like a nightmare. Each doorway had the same appearance. Every turn led me back to my starting point. Chilaquims began. Every ears rang with every breath. I struck the door so forcefully that it slammed. I opened, staggered out into the chilly air, and continued to run until I came to the truck. Once more, the radio hissed. Next, "Gates open." I said in a whisper over the static as I glanced back across the yard. Wide swinging the gate was. The unbroken, the chain was still hanging from the post. That's how I left it. I took a car down didn't slow down until I noticed the first flicker of the mountain, the fog breaking up in waves around the headlights, and bars for cell service. Narrative 7. I found myself in a location known as Dalton's Crossing that October. You would miss it if you blinked while driving through. Entirely. One gas station that closed too early, a few dilapidated homes, and a single traffic light that blinked redly the entire night. The lodge was a mile or so down the road. Just beyond it, the woodland was packed. The branches were so close to it that they appeared to be bending over the roof in an attempt to pull it back into the woods. Eli, the proprietor, was a man who appeared to have been carved from the same wood that had been used to construct the establishment. Tall, silent, and with hands as coarse as bark. He assured me that the work was simple. This time of year, mostly truckers and hunters, he added, leaning against the countertop. Simply keep the lights low and the coffee hot. He made a cash payment without paying taxes. Forms without inquiries. I didn't give a damn. I was exhausted, and it sounded sufficiently steady. Both shifting. I would have turned around at that moment if I had known why no one lasted more than a week. My very first evening went off without any problems. I restocked the soda machine, swept the porch, checked in 2 silent mails, and wrote in my notepad for the majority of the night. There were just 6 rooms in the lodge, and they were all arranged in a row. Own door that faces the parking lot. The office had yellowed lighting and was modest but cozy, with the subtle scent of old pine cleaner and coffee. It was the kind of comfortable, slightly dilapidated space that gave you a sense of safer than you should probably be. I had gotten used to the rhythm. By midnight, I would write something down every hour, simply to keep the time flowing in the journal. Minor things like a car passing at coffee is stale again at 12:12, nothing out of the ordinary. On the second evening, right before headlights flickered across the office window at 10 o'clock, a pickup with a harsh, idle engine rolled in. The individual who stepped wore a gray jacket covered in crusted mud and was tall and broad-shouldered. When he arrived, he didn't glance at me, simply displayed a folded bundle of dollars inside. "Room," he said. His tone had that slow, drawn-out voice of someone from the Highlands, but it sounded tight, as if every word were painful to his throat. I handed him the room 4 key. He gave a brief, hollow smile, then turned to go. I said, "Could you sign the guest book?" He paused, gazed at the pen, and left immediately. Without coming into contact with it, there was a single weary jingle from the bell over the door. That was it. Eli arrived the following morning carrying a box of supplies. I brought up the man. Eli scowled, tapped the hooks, and proceeded to the key rack. Each key remains in existence, including the room 4-1. The room had not been used for years, he informed me. There was water on the floorboards. Harm caused by a burst pipe. Perhaps I misinterpreted the number, he replied, but I hadn't. I could still imagine his boots scuffing the linoleum with dust. The silence began to annoy after the 3rd night. Hear me. Something about the darkness outside feels heavier, more substantial. After 9 outside, the road died. There were no lights or engines, only the sound of silence hammering on the walls. At approximately 9:30, I heard the front door was open. Above it, the small bell jingled once. I raised my head. No, there was one. Suddenly, the air felt cooler, as if someone had just entered. The door gently closed by itself, and long after that, the bell continued to shake. I went outside to be sure, and I noticed damp tracks on the porch, far apart, moving in the direction of the property. Halfway across the gravel, they came to a stop and simply stopped. No vehicle, no tire scuffs, nothing. Under the porch light, the prints shone as if they had just been created. My notepad was open on the desk when I returned. On the final page, 2 words, Night 3, were written in crooked handwriting. Initially, I believed Eli was playing a practical joke. Locals claimed he didn't retain employees for very long. Perhaps this was how he weeded individuals out. However, the writing did not appear to be his or anyone else's. The letters were wobbly and rigid. Instead of fading black, the ink turned gray, as though something that hadn't functioned properly for years had been used to scroll it. It was about 11 o'clock when the phone rang. The noise caused me to jump. "Dalton Lodge, how can I?" I asked, attempting to seem calm. "Help you?" The voice was raspy and low. There was stillness after, "Room 4 is leaking again." The line died after crackling for a few seconds. I simply held the receiver while standing there. The telephone system was outdated. Since there hadn't been any rain for days, it might have been interference. I took the extra key out of the drawer and headed toward the rooms down the short hallway. The planks creaked with every step, louder than it ought to have been. The air became thicker and colder halfway down, as if you were entering a cellar. The fourth room's the door was slightly ajar, light streaming out faintly. I gave it a gentle shove. The lamp inside flickered briefly before going off. The sink overflowed as water gradually flowed from the bathroom faucet, extending over the floor. As I approached, I noticed words on the obscured mirror. No more evenings. I quickly retreated. The hallway didn't look right as I turned around. 6 doors should have been present, however. There were more today than ever before, extending farther below. There was a buzz in the air, dimly like static in the distance. I moved swiftly, perhaps even ran, until I arrived at the workplace. There was cash in the drawer. There was no guest book left. The front door was locked, but above it, the bell moved softly, as if someone had just passed through. Behind the counter, I sat until, trying not to breathe too loudly, the sky began to become pale. Eli arrived at 7 o'clock, crisp as usual. I told him everything. He did not pause, did not chuckle. After I was done, he simply stated in a low voice, "You saw him then." I looked he waited. He sat down on the stool next to the desk, poured himself some coffee, and told me the story. The lodge, he claimed to have been a part of a former mining camp in the 1950s. A miner checked into the hotel one night during a strong storm. 4. After the company closed, he was among the last men still employed. That evening, he had returned to the mine to get his tools back. The shaft was inundated by daybreak. His truck was located. He parked outside the lodge but did not return. Eli claimed that every few years, someone hears him again complaining. He informed me that no one stayed for very long after the leak, leaving footprints and signing the book, so I left before he could add anything more. He didn't protest. As I turned to go, he gave me a torn piece of folded paper. My name was written neatly and centered across the guest book. However, it wasn't my handwriting. Night 4 was written beneath it. I didn't stick. I started my car, packed my suitcase, and didn't check inside to ask inquiries. The rearview mirror until I could just make out Dalton's Crossing. Continued until the mountains were only a line on the horizon. In October of the following year, my phone rings once every night at around 10 o'clock, but it never stops. I hear water dripping when I pick it up, and the caller ID indicates room 4 twice. Slowly, steadily, the connection clicks dead, then faintly on the other end. After that, like the air outside that lodge, the flat has a subtle scent of damp wood and ancient soil. I've switched my number 3 times, yet the calls continue to reach me. Last week, I disconnected the phone from the wall, but it still came through. Music. Stop telling people about it. Narrative 8. After his mother remarried a man named Carl, my cousin Mason had recently moved in with us. Mason claimed he didn't like him and that he was fake, lovely, the type of person who smiled too much without blinking enough. Mason packed up after the wedding. He was 17 years old, constantly carried a duffel bag, and stated that he would prefer to sleep on our couch than beneath Carl's roof. Restless, constantly behaving as if nothing frightened him, the type of child who would deliberately go through a graveyard to make a point, but it was clear that he lacked courage. We lived in a 2-bedroom trailer, nestled deep in the hills on the outskirts of Calver Creek, and I detested being bored. Where the road ended, posing as pavement, prior to the company's withdrawal, the area was a mining village, and left half a forest of rusty machinery behind. After rain, the creek continued to shimmer in odd colors, as everyone knew. However, there was little discussion about it. It was early October, that strange time of year when the air becomes more abrasive, and Mason returned from the woods with this, and it reminded me of that morning. The leaves haven't decided on a color yet. He claimed to have found something, but it wasn't a shed. He had a tight, perplexed expression, maybe an ancient vehicle, something odd. He informed me that there were stairs outside. On a slope next to the quarry, stone ones were carved directly into the ground. He claimed they terminated there and didn't continue anywhere. He claimed that when he stood on them, he heard a hum, as if the person who constructed them had grown weary and given up halfway up the hill. In his teeth and his ears began to ring, so I told him, laughing, that he had most likely discovered a half-collapsed mason. Shook his head. We had a lot of that out there. Bits of old houses swallowed by the woods. Claimed that it wasn't like that, and that the steps weren't even packed into actual ground or connected to anything. He didn't have any photos, and he left his phone charging at home, but he told me that could drive me there. So that day, we got the crank flashlight out of the shed, packed a thermos of cider, and left. The road quickly narrowed and wound around stumps in the unfriendly woods behind the quarry, and slippery roots. Mason hacked through them as if he had done it 100 times, brambles without reducing speed, and I trailed behind, attempting to avoid tripping, past the kind of trash that people just threw away, 2 rusting automobiles, a tire swing without tires, and half a refrigerator. The rope. We once discovered a tiny circle of stones that had been scorched by previous fires. The odor was subtle, but nevertheless that bitter, charred smell of something that isn't quite wood. After roughly 40, the steps appeared to be incorrect, so Mason paused and pointed. There, he murmured. Even with all the moss clinging, the 8 stone ones were too uniform and spotless around the edges. There was nothing above or below them, except dead roots curling through crevices as they sat halfway up a little hill. Mason remarked, "See," pointing to the heaps of leaves in the corners that don't lead anywhere. Solid, frigid, chilly. I tapped one with my shoe while kneeling next to them. Then I saw a squirrel on the 3rd step, lying motionless with its eyes closed and free of rot or blood. Mason swore it hadn't been there yesterday, and he picked up a pine, as if it had suddenly chosen to stop breathing, cone, and threw it down the stairs. It bounced thrice before coming to a stop occurred. He then climbed up to the top step, smiling as he glanced down at me. "Are you feeling anything?" I responded, "No," and he moved his weight. "It seems like it's humming," he whispered. He laughed beneath my feet and took a step down, then another. He stopped after the 5th step, and his face turned pale, shaky. "Hey," I said. "How are you?" His eyes seemed strange as he stared up at me, not paying attention. "You don't sense that?" I shook my head when he asked, and he grinned once again, but it didn't look right. Then he said, "Watch." He took the 8th step and was gone, gone, gone. Blink, and the place where he had been was empty. I rushed forward, my pulse thumping in my chest. Felt colder, heavier in some way. I went around, thinking he might have jumped down behind the slope, but the ground was flat, with no dip, pit, or area large enough for hiding. I yelled his. I went down the steps myself after calling my name till my throat hurt. The dirt was solid beneath me. I sprinted home without any pull, vibration, or sound other than the wind. Mom was waiting for me on the porch, and she became silent as I told her what had happened. When Uncle arrived that night, he stated Mason had most likely just taken off again. It previously vanished for a few days and reappeared as if nothing had occurred, but I knew this time was different. That evening, at around 1 in the morning, they sat by the window and gazed at the tree line. Just a glimmer of shadow between the trees, but something moved, I assured myself. It was a deer. The following day, I returned outside with Mason's hoodie and one of my uncle's, avoiding the bus. Hunting lanterns. I went along the same path, but it seemed to go on forever. Every sound, the flap of wings, the crunch of twigs, seemed too near. My hands wouldn't quit trembling. I paused when I got to the hill. The stairs weren't the same. I double-checked, and there were now 13. Each one appeared darker. I just stood there looking, trying to think of what to do, and they were slicker, as if someone had cleaned them. My name was shouted, but it was only said gently, like an inquiry, when I heard it. Mason's voice, although it sounded slower, as if he were talking through an underwater fan, turned in the direction of the lantern shining sound. and something crawled low between the trees. Wore Mason's jacket. At first I thought it may be him, looking hurt and perplexed, but then I noticed how its arms bowed incorrectly, too long at the elbows, crawled behind a log, and then popped out once again. The lantern caught its face as it approached, and it resembled Mason nearly exactly. Same eyes and jawline, but the skin was slippery and waxy like melted candle wax, layers of hardening. Its eyes blinked too slowly and erratically, and when the mouth opened, nothing came out. Just a lengthy period of my jaw unhinged as if it was trying to recall what speech was, and I staggered back, catching a root with my heel. It stopped as it got to the bottom step, cocking its head like a dog hearing a distant sound, and then it moved one palm onto the first step. I decided that was sufficient and ran without turning around. When I finally saw the trailer again, my chest ached from the branches tearing my jacket and the mud splashing up to my knees. Running. I tightened the blinds and shut all the windows that evening. I heard 3 slow, even taps on the glass at midnight, followed by stillness. 3 taps at night, the same thing. I installed a trail camera I discovered in the shed. It only captured 10 seconds of static when pointed directly at the window. Midnight. After a week, I was unable to endure it any longer, so I informed my mother I was going to stay with my aunt in Raleigh, but I didn't explain why, and she didn't inquire, but she appeared exhausted. Mason never returned, and I left before sunset, as if she already knew there was nothing she could do. Everyone said he had done it previously, and the police issued flyers listing him as a runaway, but no one really looked. However, I am aware of what I witnessed, and occasionally I dream about those steps. Continue to grow. 13 turns into 20, then 30. Each darker one stretches into the ground, and occasionally I think I hear that voice again when I wake up, uttering my name, the manner in which you performed that day. Cautious, slow, as if you were practicing. I have since returned to Calvert Creek, but I never longer approach the trees. Music, Narrative 9. I was switching between seasonal positions that fall, the kind of temporary work that hardly covered my rent. Paid, the refrigerator was stocked, and a friend told me that a logistics company in Johnson County was recruiting that evening. It was not a glamorous job for drivers to transport medical supplies to clinics located throughout the Appalachian regions. Employment, but it was consistent, and the evenings were typically calm. You would begin your shift at dusk, load the truck, and with just a radio, a stack of delivery slips, and a coffee thermos, spend hours navigating back roads that cut in and out of static. I actually liked being alone, so I didn't mind. By late October, I could drive every rise, every bend, every tiny pocket on those roads without the GPS. I was familiar with the hollows of fog that clung to them. But one Tuesday, just before, the paper was still warm when I tore it off, and it listed a new address that had arrived through the printer after I had logged out. I had never heard of the temporary medical station on the Juniper Hollow expansion. I looked at the wall map and saw that the notation read, "Priority medical refrigerant delivered before midnight." There was no extension on Juniper Hollow Road, which stopped abruptly in a wooded area. Nothing more than the ancient coal mine that had closed decades ago. Rick, the night supervisor, rubbed his eyes and peered at the slip when I inquired if he had seen the location previously. "They've been building out there since spring, so it's new construction," he added. "If the GPS provides you with locations, follow things." The GPS did indeed load anything, displaying a small gray line branching off the main route. Only one destination, no other intersections, and no way back path. A single, desolate road that was absent from any of our printed maps. Nevertheless, it made sense to me that it was one of those temporary medical outposts that they occasionally erect before winter storms arrive. Around 9 o'clock, I left the factory, and the air had that icy, metallic sting that always precedes the first snowfall. A few languid snowflakes were caught drifting down through the fog by my headlights, but I drove 2 counties without seeing a single car, and it seemed as though the entire area was melting before it even touched the road. Asleep. Everything had been engulfed by fog by the time I arrived at Juniper Hollow. The road, which was small and damaged, was surrounded by skeleton trees that leaned close together like they were listening in. About 3 miles in, I reached the final mailbox. The GPS suddenly said, "Turn left," even though there was simply woodland. Slowed, scowling. I could see it as my beam flicked across the trees, but there was no crossroads. Fresh pavement, an unusual blacktop strip slicing through the forest, dark and smooth, devoid of any traces or markings. It appeared too flawless, too tidy. I paused, but the GPS arrow blinked persistently, so I turned, as if it had been poured that morning. The road curved downhill, getting tighter and tighter, the radio going to static, the fog getting thicker till I could hardly see my hood. When the phone went to 0 bars, the only sounds I could hear were the engine's low hum and the steady hiss of tires on wet pavement. Tarmac. After 3 miles, 4 and 5 miles, I checked the odometer, but nothing had changed. I initially believed it was a porch light, but as I approached, I noticed a faint orange glow in the distance. More like a lantern. Out of the mist, a large, sagging 2-story home appeared. Sitting in a clearing by myself, with no cars, electricity wires, or movement. The coordinates matched exactly, but it didn't look new, it looked forgotten. I parked on the gravel drive and turned off the ignition, but the paper on my dash still said, "Deliver before midnight, engine." Immediately the hush descended, and I could hear the faint tick of the cooling system and my own breathing. Engine. Then I saw the shadow of a moving figure in one of the windows. I took the delivery box from the seat and saw a woman, perhaps, moving from one side of the room to the other. I knocked, and the door, marked "Keep Cool Medical Samples," opened nearly at one point, a woman in her late 20s or possibly 30s, wearing a simple sweater, stood there as if she had been waiting directly behind it. And jeans, her eyes a bit too still, her smile courteous but rigid. I told her I could leave it at the door. "You're late," she said. "Bring it in, please." Her tone was bland, not angry. "It needs to be refrigerated. The refrigerator is in the kitchen." The house had a slight smell of dust and antiseptic. The walls were empty. Antique, mismatched furniture was placed at strange angles, as if it had been pulled in from other homes. One kerosene, I followed her into the dim amber glow of the lantern burning on the counter. The kitchen, and placed the package on the table. The old refrigerator in the corner was of the heavy metal type. Handle. The cord was coiled on the floor, and she saw me. It was not plugged in. She turned her head slightly, as if listening for something behind her. "It's been giving us trouble," she replied. Her. That's when I heard it. A calm, low voice from a man's deeper. It said, "Ask him to check the date," and the woman stopped in her tracks. Her shoulders tensed, and she didn't turn or respond when the voice repeated itself. Asking him to look at the label's date revealed that it wasn't seem urgent. It sounded prepared, as if he had said it numerous times before. I looked down at the box and saw that there was no label, no date printed anywhere. I felt sick to my stomach, and I turned to face the hallway, which was pitch black, only to see a white sticker ripped at the corner. There was a door at the end of it that was slightly open, and beyond that it was black, save for a dim reflection of the lantern light. Nothing. Trying to maintain a steady tone, I said, "I'll come back when the paperwork clears," but the woman didn't react. She breathed quickly and shallowly, and then I heard a faint sound behind me. I turned and walked down a meandering, uneven brook that sounded like someone shifting their weight on ancient floorboards. Not running, but not lingering either, I went directly to the door. As soon as I stepped onto the porch, I heard what sounded like a foot dragging on the interior floor, and without turning around, I leaped into the truck and slammed the door and put it in reverse. I noticed her when the headlights struck the home. Stood in the doorway once more, arms slack, gaze focused directly ahead. In the corridor behind her, a tall guy with a long face and thin shoulders stood right in front of the ray of... I continued driving until I reached the main road, at which point I looked at the GPS and saw that the gray line had been wiped by the sweeping light. Was gone. All that was visible on the screen was a green region marked Unmapped Area, There was no road, no destination, nothing. I called dispatch after pulling into a diner off the highway, but the line went out twice before. After reading the address and telling Rick where I had been, he was silent for a while before responding. "Lorne, there isn't a drop planned for tonight. There isn't an expansion to Juniper Hollow." I informed him that I had he requested the order number, saying it didn't match anything in the slip that was there in front of me. "Just come back," he replied at last, sounding scared. "We'll figure it out. Out tomorrow." I couldn't resist driving back out the next morning. There, the same path, the same twists, but when I arrived at the location of the new road, it wasn't. There was only a tangled dirt trail obstructed by boulders and branches, with no new tarmac, no house, no clearing. I made a stop at a small local store close to. The elderly man behind the counter knew everyone in the neighborhood, so I went to the foot of the hill. Inquired as to whether a boarding house or medical station had ever existed up there. He scowled, considering. "House," he added. "It burned down in the 1980s when the mine closed. No one rebuilt." I didn't press. I thanked him, got a coffee, and walked away. Rick tried to talk me out of it by saying I just needed rest, but when I told him I was done that night and turned in my pickup, the identical delivery box, the one marked "Keep Cool," was there when I went to get my jacket from the loading dock, but I stopped cold. Medical samples that were still sealed, resting on the floor next to the entrance, without any condensation, a label date, or any papers, just as it had been, with no one signing for it, not even recalled logging it. I simply went outside, got into my car, and headed north without asking any questions. Pause until my phone signal returned and I was outside the mountains. Narrative 10. I accepted this temporary position performing maintenance at an ancient mountain resort close to Laurel Ridge, West Virginia. The location was miles away from the closest town, nestled between dense forests and a lodge that was partially closed for the off-season. Slopes that captured fog like a net. By October, the majority of visitors had left, leaving only a few employees, and I wanted a lot of quiet, space, calm, and something easy to fill my time before winter arrived. They provided me with a cabin up a steep gravel road that was unique from the others. It was little, with only 2 rooms and a small kitchen, and you had a loft. It had been used before. The boards groaned but remained sturdy, and the rear door opened down into a precipitous plunge of hillside with only trees beyond that. On my first night there, I ran that back door closed without hesitation. Everything was good at first. I established a routine that included waking up at the crack of dawn, inspecting the pathways for fallen branches, scraping leaves from the lodge gutters. I read dog-eared, ate whatever came in cans, and replaced broken signs along the trails. It was a quiet type of life, reading paperbacks by lantern light and making phone calls home when I could locate a signal, modest and steady. And the generator's quiet hum was the only actual sound at night. I enjoyed it that way, floating from the lodge below. Following years of cacophony, and it was nice to disappear for a bit, folks. Then, one evening, after a long day, I returned late, half freezing and too exhausted to think. As I put my gloves down and closed the front door, I heard this faint. There was a faint, metallic clinking sound coming from the rear of the cabin. It wasn't loud. More, I initially believed I had left the pot swinging from a hook, but it seemed more like 2 pieces of metal brushing against each other. Continued, steady and rhythmic, right at the back door. I reached for my flashlight and approached. The handle was moving. Not too much, but it was moving. Tiny trembling twist, as if someone were cautiously and slowly testing it. I froze there, listening, waiting for footsteps, my throat drying up from the metal latch grinding against the bolt. Or breathing or something. Then, just as my hand was about to reach out, the movement abruptly stopped, and I stood. The flashlight beam trembled slightly in my fingers as I stood motionless for what seemed like minutes before locking the dead bolt. Once more, and convinced myself that the frame was being moved by the wind or the cold. I repeatedly reminded myself that it expands, contracts, and cacks. It happened again that night while I was weeding on the couch. A quick, purposeful rattling from the back door, followed by another. This time, it wasn't random. Rather, it had a rhythm, as if someone were gently trying to twist the latch to see if I'd react. I yelled something that was half scared and half angry, but there was no response. Slight scrape of metal. I moved in, attempting to seem composed, and placed my hand. Something pulled from the opposite side once, forcefully enough to make the hinges, as soon as I pressed against the wood, creak deep into the picture. I staggered back, picked up my flashlight, and hurled the door open. There was no wind, no dirt footprints, and the air outside was completely still. I quickly closed the door, bolted it again, and felt as though the entire forest had paused to listen. I sat up and stared at it for the remainder of the night, and by daylight, I had convinced myself that it must be temperature changes or something. Despite an animal touching the handle, I went into town, purchased a padlock, and I slept better that night for a while after I locked it through the door handle to prevent it from moving again. Then, around, I felt like someone was crushing down on my chest when I woke up in the middle of the night in mid-October and was having trouble breathing. I sat up, gasping, but my lungs wouldn't let the breath out of my chest. The room whirled golden in the lamplight. My hands tingled, and my heart pounded in my ears, and I struggled to stand, taking a few steps before my legs gave out. I grabbed my phone, blacked out on the floor after managing to cry for assistance, and when I awoke there were paramedics kneeling next to me, claiming that I had hyperventilated, most likely due to anxiety or tension, and they dragged me to I was detained overnight for observation at a little hospital in Fairview, and the doctor inquired as to whether I had been under any pressure, if I was getting a good night's sleep, if anything odd had occurred. I denied everything, informed me that stress doesn't always have a negative impact on people, but that solitude, particularly in the mountains, can have odd effects. He added, "Start in your head. Sometimes it's in the air." I nodded, not really understanding, and by morning they sent me back up. The rear door was ajar when I arrived at the cottage, and the padlock was still hanging there, intact, but the door. It was open, swaying a little in the wind, and everything inside seemed undamaged, like a blanket. The air smelt, the books were stacked, the lamp was off, and everything else was in its proper position, lightly like smoke. Old, like charred wood, but not new or powerful. Mats 4 had gone cold. I spent a considerable amount of time staring at that door in an attempt to determine. Later that day, I visited the lodge to find out how it could have opened from the inside after I had closed it from the outside. Tom, the manager, listened as I explained everything to him, including the noise, the lock, the hospital stay, and the open door. "Nobody stays up there long," he groaned, seemingly taken aback. "Not since the accident." He paused when I asked what accident it was, then mentioned a caretaker who had worked there years ago, got snowed in one winter, and never came out. It wasn't until the thaw that they discovered him. Stood empty until they reopened for seasonal labor. "It's just an old story," Tom replied with a half smile. Don't allow I tried to laugh it off, but the story stuck with me, and I kept picturing him imprisoned up, there, freezing and alone, waiting out the storm. That evening I made sure I hardly slept at all, but nothing happened with any of the locks or windows. A few days later, I noticed some vehicles parked close to the beginning of my trail when I returned from town as the light was going out. Between the trees, lanterns flashed, and a group of locals stood in a small circle, wrapped in coats, some with folded blankets, others with flowers, claimed they were performing a blessing while waving me over in a red flannel jacket. I responded, "What?" He turned to face the hill and mutely uttered, "For the man who froze up there. To give him peace, we visit every October on the day they discovered him." Superstition wasn't a factor in. His tone was one of matter-of-fact grief, and as I was at a loss for words, I simply nodded and followed them. Stopped at my stairs, placed a brown jacket that appeared to be decades old and a few old photos on it, and lit a candle. Another said a prayer. The flannel-clad man turned to face me and added, "I stayed alone too." Then he smiled at me with a little understanding smile. Same cabin, same time of year. The woodland was oddly calm when they departed, not empty, but as if he knew I had been hearing things too. Settled. There were no noises at all that night, no rattling, no creaking, and no weight on my chest. I slept through the morning for the first time in weeks, and when I woke up, the sun was piercing the trees and the thin white lines. Although everything appeared to be normal, the silence was oppressive, like a mountain had at last become silent permanently, so I carefully gathered my belongings, I left the key on the counter, switched off the lantern, and stood by that back of the house before going outside. The door was locked, the padlock was cold and immobile, and I didn't touch it. The road wound through fog and leaves, and the journey down the ridge seemed to go on forever. Halfway down, the air felt clear and open, and I was able to breathe deeper than I had in weeks. Light. I never returned to Laurel Ridge until the woods eventually parted and I entered the roadway. I didn't even contact regarding my most recent paycheck after that,